before I tell you what I found in that attic, you need to know something. There are people in your life you trust so completely that you never imagine them looking you in the eye while destroying you. You don't see it coming because you're too busy loving them. That's the real tragedy of what happened to me. Not just what they did, but that they did it while I was making them pies and calling them to say goodnight. If you find this story compelling, please like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories that matter. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment and tell us your location. We read every single one. Now, let me take you back to a Tuesday morning in October, when everything changed. I was 65 years old, standing in my kitchen in upstate New York when my phone rang. My son had called to tell me that Aunt Rebecca's house had finally sold. Rebecca, my sister, had passed away 6 months earlier. The house in Florida was the last major thing to sort through, and the estate lawyer was asking if I wanted any of her belongings shipped to me. I almost laughed. After everything that had happened between us, I didn't want anything from Rebecca except distance and the truth. But the lawyer mentioned something that made me pause. He said there were boxes, old boxes, from when we were young, from before everything fell apart. Did I want those? I told him yes before I could think twice. 2 weeks later, those boxes arrived at my door. Inside were things I hadn't seen in 40 years, school photos, old letters, a ceramic cat I'd made in 5th grade that Rebecca had kept all this time. And then, tucked into the bottom of the 3rd box, I found it, a leather diary with gold trim, Rebecca's handwriting on the inside cover. The date started in 1993. My hands started shaking the moment I opened it. I didn't read it that day. I couldn't. I was already crying, and I didn't even know why. I just held it and looked at the date on the first entry. March 15, 1993, 2 years before everything exploded. 2 years before my marriage ended. 2 years before my family stopped speaking to me like I was a person and started speaking about me like I was a problem to solve. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with tea that went cold, and I opened the diary. The first entry was casual. Rebecca wrote about going to lunch with Michael, my husband. She wrote about how charming he was, how he made her laugh, how he kept touching her arm when he thought I wasn't looking. I read those words once, then again, then a 3rd time, waiting for them to make sense, waiting for there to be a punchline. There wasn't one. I kept reading. By May, the tone had changed. Rebecca's entries were filled with guilt, but also with something else. Calculation. She wrote about how Michael had said he was unhappy, how he felt trapped, how Rebecca was the only one who understood him. She wrote about a plan, not in those exact words, but the meaning was there in the spaces between the sentences. A plan to get closer to him, a plan to push me away, a plan that involved my family, my reputation, and everything I had built. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my therapist. I told her I needed an emergency session. When I came in, I was holding that diary like it was made of glass. I told Dr. Morrison what I'd found, and she did something I'll never forget. She asked me if I was ready to know the whole truth. She asked if knowing would help me heal, or if it would destroy me all over again. I thought about that for a long time. Then I told her I needed to know, because for 30 years I had blamed myself. For 30 years I had believed that I was the problem, that I was unstable, that I was difficult, that I deserved what happened to me. If this diary proved otherwise, I needed to read every single word. So I did. Over the next 3 days, I read Rebecca's diary from 1993 to 1995. I read her plans written in her own handwriting. I read about meetings with a man named Hartman, a real estate developer. I read about money changing hands. I read about how Rebecca and Michael had orchestrated the destruction of my marriage as though it were a business project with phases and milestones and success metrics. Phase 1, Rebecca called it, was to make me jealous and angry, to create conflict between me and Michael so that I would seem unstable. She wrote about how she would call Michael late at night, how she would tell him that I was cold, that I didn't understand him, that she was the only one who could. She even wrote down the dates and times of their meetings, like she was keeping a record for evidence. Phase 2 was to make sure my family saw only Rebecca's side. She wrote about strategy, about how to present herself as the stable one and me as the paranoid one. She wrote about sending my mother flowers, about calling my father to ask for advice, making him feel important and protective of her. She even wrote about recording conversations and editing them to make me sound worse than I was. I had to put the diary down at that point. I was shaking so badly I couldn't hold it. But I went back, because I had to know, I had to see it all. Phase 3 was the endgame, the land, Grandma Dot's land. My grandmother had owned 300 acres in the Hudson Valley since 1890. It had been in our family for over 100 years. She had promised it to me. She had told me just weeks before she passed away that the land would be mine someday, that I should raise my family there, that my children would know that land like she knew it, like my mother knew it. It was supposed to be my legacy. It was supposed to mean something. Rebecca knew that. Everyone knew that. In her diary, Rebecca wrote about the land like it was a prize to be won. She wrote about Hartman properties and the millions of dollars they were willing to pay for development rights. She wrote about how, if she could control the land, if she could get it away from me, she and Michael could be rich. Really rich. Rich enough to start over. Rich enough to disappear from our small town and never look back. And then came the entry that made me understand everything. October 15, 1995. Rebecca had written, "It's finally happening. Carol is due any day now. Michael says she's been complaining about feeling sick. If she loses the baby, Michael says she'll fall apart completely. No one will believe her about anything anymore. My mother will see her as broken. My father will think she's weak. She'll have no credibility, no power. And then we move on phase 3. The land transfer will be easy after that. No one will question me if Carol is too devastated to even think about it. Michael is perfect at this. He really is." My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the diary. It fell to the floor, and I remember staring at it like it was a live thing. Because what I had just read wasn't speculation. It wasn't a theory or a recovered memory or trauma talking. It was my sister, in her own handwriting, describing a plan to make me lose my baby. Describing it like it was a strategy. Describing it like I wasn't a person at all. I had lost my baby on October 22, 1995. 7 days after she wrote that entry. I called Dr. Morrison again, and this time I asked her something I had never asked before. I asked her if people could be that cruel, if sisters could plan something like that, if the world really contained that much darkness. She told me yes. She told me that some people could, and she told me that the fact that I was surprised by this answer meant I was not one of them. That's when I made a decision. I was going to find out the whole truth, every detail, every player, everyone who had been part of this conspiracy. Because for 30 years, I had been carrying guilt that didn't belong to me. For 30 years, I had been running from a version of myself that was a lie. And I was done running. After I finished reading Rebecca's diary, I did something I hadn't done in 3 decades. I called my mother. It was a Saturday morning, and I knew she'd be in her garden. She always was on Saturday mornings. I could picture her there, on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds that didn't belong. I wondered if she'd ever thought about how strange it was that she'd been so good at removing weeds from her garden, but so bad at seeing the poison that had grown in her own family. "Mom," I said when she picked up, "I need to talk to you about 1995, about the year everything fell apart, and I need you to tell me the truth." There was silence on the other end, a long silence, long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then she said, "Carol, that was a long time ago. Why do you want to dig all that up now?" I told her about the diary. I told her what Rebecca had written. I told her that I had proof, that everything she and Dad had believed about me was constructed, that it was a lie built by people she loved more than she loved me. My mother started crying, and then she started talking. What came out of her mouth over the next hour was a confession disguised as an explanation. She told me that Rebecca had come to her in 1994, just after my 2nd wedding anniversary. Rebecca had said she was worried about me, that Michael had confided in her that I was having episodes, that I was paranoid and controlling, that Rebecca was afraid I might hurt myself or the baby I was carrying. My mother had believed her, because Rebecca was so calm about it. Because Rebecca cried real tears when she talked about her concern for me, because my mother wanted to believe that her daughters could be close, and if Rebecca was worried about me, then my mother could swoop in and protect both of us. She could be the hero of her own story. But then my mother said something that changed how I understood everything. She said, "Your father and I thought you were having a mental breakdown. And then when you lost the baby, we thought maybe you'd tried to hurt yourself. We thought that's why you lost it." I had to sit down. I had to actually sit down on the floor of my kitchen. All this time, my parents hadn't just abandoned me. They had feared me. They had believed I was capable of harming my own child. Rebecca had planted that seed so carefully that it had grown into a forest of suspicion. And my family had walked through that forest for 30 years, never once questioning whether it was real. I asked my mother if she knew about the land, if she knew about Hartman Properties or the plan to take Grandma Dot's farm away from me. She said no, but she said it too quickly. I pressed her. I told her I had it in writing. I told her that if she didn't tell me everything, I was going to hire a lawyer and take the truth to court. And I meant it. That's when she broke. She told me that Dad had known. Dad had known about Hartman Properties because he worked in real estate. He had even introduced Rebecca to the developer. He thought it was a smart business move. He thought the land should be developed. He thought that Grandma Dot was being sentimental about 300 acres that were just sitting there doing nothing. He had enabled the whole thing. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I couldn't listen anymore. I couldn't hear my father's selfishness dressed up as practicality. The next thing I did was hire a lawyer. His name was James Chen, and he was exactly what I needed. He was a forensic financial investigator who specialized in inheritance fraud. When I showed him the diary and told him the story, he didn't look shocked or sympathetic. He looked interested. He looked like someone who had seen this kind of cruelty before and knew exactly how to untangle it. James asked me a series of questions. When did my grandmother change her will? How long before I lost the baby? What was the timeline of the land transfer? Who had signed the papers? I told him that I didn't know the answers to most of those questions, but I knew who would. I knew that my grandmother had kept meticulous records. I knew that my father had kept files. And I knew that if we dug deep enough, we would find the evidence. James started with public records. He found that Grandma Dot's will had been changed in October 1995, the very month I lost my baby. The very month that Rebecca's diary documented the final phase of the plan. The new will left the farm to Rebecca. It cut me out completely. My grandmother had signed the new will in a lawyer's office in Albany, with Rebecca present as a witness. When James showed me the signature on that document, I cried, because my grandmother's handwriting was shaky. It didn't look right. It looked like the signature of someone who was confused or coerced or both. James said he wanted to bring in a handwriting expert. He wanted to investigate whether my grandmother had been competent when she signed that new will. He said that if he could prove she'd been manipulated or wasn't of sound mind, the whole thing could be invalidated. But there was a problem. My grandmother had died in 1996, and Rebecca had been the executor of her estate, which meant Rebecca had controlled what happened to the land, and what Rebecca had done was sell it. She had sold Grandma Dot's 300 acres to Hartman Properties in 1997 for $8 million. $8 million that went into Rebecca's bank account. $8 million that built a mansion in Florida and paid for Rebecca's comfortable life, while I was working 2 jobs just to keep my small house. I asked James if there was any way we could still fight this, if there was any way to recover what had been stolen from me. He told me that it would be hard, it would be expensive, it would take years, and we would have to prove that Rebecca had acted with intent to defraud. We would have to prove that she had manipulated my grandmother into changing her will. We would have to prove that the whole thing was a conspiracy. I asked him how much of the diary he needed to make that case. He smiled and said, "All of it." While James was building the legal foundation for what would become the biggest fight of my life, something else was happening. My father had a stroke. It was a massive stroke, the kind that doesn't give you time to make peace with anyone or apologize for anything. One day he was walking around telling people they were being too sensitive about the past. The next day he was in a hospital bed, unable to speak or move the left side of his body. I didn't go see him. I couldn't. I was too angry, I was too hurt, and I was too busy trying to gather evidence for a trial. My father died 3 months later. At his funeral, I stood in the back of the church and watched my mother weep. I watched Rebecca comfort her, rubbing her back and whispering in her ear. I watched my brother, who had always been closer to Rebecca than to me, accept Rebecca's embrace like it was the most natural thing in the world. No one asked me to speak. No one asked me where I'd been for the last 30 years. No one asked me why I'd missed so many family events or why I rarely answered my phone when they called. They had already made their decision about me, and I had spent 3 decades accepting it as true. But not anymore. After my father's funeral, I met with James again. I gave him everything I had: the diary, copies of bank records I'd obtained through a private investigator, old emails that I'd printed out from the early days of the internet when Rebecca and Michael were still sloppy about covering their tracks, recordings of phone conversations where my mother had accidentally confirmed details about the conspiracy. James organized it all like a puzzle. He showed me how each piece fit with the others, how Rebecca's plan in the diary matched the financial transactions that had actually occurred, how the timeline of events lined up perfectly with the changes to my grandmother's will. He said, "Carol, this isn't circumstantial. This is airtight. If we can get this in front of a judge, you're going to win." But before we could file the case, something happened that none of us expected. Rebecca got sick. She had always been careful about her health. She went to the gym. She ate organic. She took vitamins. But in the spring of 2010, she was diagnosed with cancer. Aggressive, advanced cancer that had already spread to her liver and her lungs. She died 3 months later. When I heard the news, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. I felt sad. Not sad that Rebecca was gone, but sad for all the years that could have been something different. Sad for my grandmother, who had been manipulated into betraying me. Sad for my parents, who had chosen to believe lies instead of believing their daughter. Most of all, I felt sad for myself, because Rebecca had taken something from me that I could never get back. She had taken my family. She had taken my home. She had taken the land that was supposed to connect me to my grandmother and my mother and my own legacy. And now she was dead, and I would never get to confront her about any of it. Or so I thought. But Rebecca wasn't finished with me yet, because after she died, her lawyer contacted me. According to Rebecca's will, I had been named as a beneficiary, a substantial beneficiary. After debts and taxes, there was approximately $4 million waiting for me. James looked at that letter and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Either Rebecca finally developed a conscience, or this is the cruelest punishment she could have devised. Money that's supposed to make you feel like the betrayal didn't matter. Money that's supposed to make you forgive." I looked at that $4 million and made a decision. I wasn't going to take it quietly. I wasn't going to let Rebecca's money buy my silence, and I wasn't going to let her death stop me from fighting for the truth. I told James that I wanted to move forward with the lawsuit. I wanted to take it all the way to court. I wanted a judge and a jury to see what Rebecca had done. I wanted the world to know that it was real. And I wanted justice. Before I talk about the trial, I need to tell you about the years in between. The years when nobody knew who I really was. The years when I was running. After everything fell apart in 1995, I couldn't stay in my small town. Everyone knew me there as the woman whose husband left her for her sister. Everyone knew me as the one who lost a baby. The story had been shaped and molded by people who wanted me gone, and it had taken a shape I couldn't escape. So I left. I packed what little I had left and I drove north to a town where no one knew my name. I was 27 years old, and I felt like I was 70. I felt like I had lived an entire lifetime in the span of 1 year. The first job I took was at a library. I didn't set out to make that my career. It just happened that way. The head librarian didn't ask many questions. She just needed someone to organize books and help patrons find what they were looking for. I was good at that. I was good at helping people find things. Maybe because I was so desperately searching for something myself. I changed my appearance. I cut my hair short and dyed it a different color. I started wearing glasses, even though I didn't really need them. I told people my name was Carol Mitchell instead of Carol Bennett. I created a version of myself that was smaller and quieter and less likely to be remembered. I became the kind of person that people looked past rather than at. For 20 years, I did this. I worked at that library. I made apple pies on Sundays and left them on neighbors' doorsteps anonymously. I volunteered for committees and organizations, always in the background, always helping, never asking for recognition. I built a life that was small enough to be safe, a life where nobody could hurt me because nobody really knew me. But I couldn't escape the story. Even in hiding, I couldn't escape it. Sometimes, years after I'd moved away, I would catch sight of my name online. Someone had written about my divorce. Someone had mentioned the scandal. Someone had kept the story alive, like it was important enough to preserve. And every time I saw my name attached to those old lies, I felt like I was drowning all over again. Michael died in 2005. He died of a heart attack in his sleep, in a house that wasn't mine, with a woman who wasn't me. I found out about it because my brother called. He called to tell me that Michael had died, like he was delivering news that should matter to me. Like 10 years of silence could be erased with a single phone call about death. I asked my brother if Rebecca was with him when it happened. He said yes. He said Rebecca was the one who found him. He said Rebecca was devastated. I hung up without saying anything else. When Rebecca died 5 years later, I was volunteering at the library when I got the call from her lawyer. I remember standing in the biography section, surrounded by stories of other people's lives, and listening to a stranger tell me that my sister had left me millions of dollars. I remember thinking that it was the most Rebecca thing she could have done. Even in death, she was trying to control me. Even in death, she was trying to rewrite the story. She was trying to give me money and make me grateful for it. She was trying to buy the version of events where she was generous and I was ungrateful. I told the lawyer that I needed time to think about it. That's when I called James Chen. That's when I decided that I was done hiding. For 3 decades, I had let Rebecca's version of events be the official story. I had let my family believe what they wanted to believe. I had let the world think that I was unstable and difficult and unworthy of the life I'd been promised. I had accepted exile as punishment for crimes I didn't commit. But that diary changed everything. That diary was Rebecca's confession, and I wasn't going to let it gather dust in some lawyer's file. I wasn't going to take her money and pretend that everything was fine. I wasn't going to let her death be the end of this story. I was going to fight. James filed the lawsuit in the summer of 2011. The case was Carol Bennett versus Hartman Properties, the estate of Rebecca Bennett, and the estate of Michael Sullivan. We were suing for fraud, undue influence, breach of fiduciary duty, and the return of the land. Hartman Properties hired expensive lawyers. They had already sold and resold the land multiple times over. There were condominiums on the property now. There were shopping centers. There were strip malls with chain restaurants and big box stores. The land had been transformed into something completely different from what it had been, and they were going to fight like hell to keep it that way. The lawyers sent discovery requests. They wanted to know everything about my life, where I'd been for the last 30 years, why I'd changed my name, why I'd taken so long to come forward. They wanted to paint me as unstable and vindictive, just like Rebecca had done. They wanted to make the jury believe that I was the kind of woman who would spend 30 years planning revenge. But that's when James brought in the handwriting expert. Her name was Dr. Patricia Williams, and she had testified in over 200 cases. She examined Grandma Dot's will and compared it to her other signatures from that time period. She found that the signature on the new will was inconsistent with Grandma Dot's normal handwriting. The pressure was different. The letter formation was different. The angle was different. Dr. Williams testified that in her professional opinion, Grandma Dot's signature had been obtained while she was under significant pressure or stress. She testified that the signature could have been coerced. She testified that she had serious doubts about whether the will was valid. Then James brought in a forensic accountant. His name was Thomas Rodriguez, and he had spent 3 months tracing every single financial transaction related to the land. He showed the jury how money had moved. He showed them the payments from Rebecca to Michael. He showed them the payments from Hartman Properties to Rebecca. He showed them the paper trail that proved it was all connected. But the most powerful evidence came from Rebecca's diary itself. James had made copies of every page. He had organized them chronologically. He had highlighted the sections that proved premeditation. And when he presented them to the jury, I watched their faces change. I watched them understand, for the first time, that this wasn't about a family disagreement. This was about a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to steal from someone and destroy her in the process. Michael had died before the trial could happen, so he couldn't be questioned. But his lawyer argued that Michael had done nothing wrong. He argued that Michael's relationship with Rebecca was consensual. He argued that Michael had simply chosen to leave me for someone else. It happened. People left their spouses all the time. There was nothing illegal about that. James stood up and said something that I will never forget. He said, "Your Honor, the defendant's lawyer wants you to believe that Michael Sullivan simply fell in love with Rebecca Bennett. But the evidence shows something very different. The evidence shows that Michael Sullivan was part of a conspiracy to defraud Carol Bennett of $8 million in land and to manipulate her elderly grandmother into changing her will. The evidence shows that Rebecca Bennett documented this conspiracy in her own handwriting. The evidence shows that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway." When Rebecca's lawyer had his turn, he tried a different strategy. He tried to make it seem like Rebecca was a victim too. He said that Rebecca had suffered from guilt for years. He said that Rebecca had been manipulated by Michael. He said that Rebecca had been a complicated woman who had made mistakes, but had ultimately tried to make amends by leaving me money in her will. I stood up then. I hadn't planned to, but I stood up. The judge looked at me with surprise, but she didn't tell me to sit down. I looked at the jury and I said, "Rebecca didn't leave me that money because she felt guilty. She left me that money because she knew the truth was coming. She left me that money to try to buy my silence. She left me that money so that I couldn't be mad at her anymore. But here's the thing about stolen goods. You can wrap them up in gold paper and put a bow on them and send them to someone as a gift. And they're still stolen. And the person who stole them is still a thief. My sister was a thief, and she stole the most important thing I had. She stole my family. She stole my home. She stole my grandmother's legacy, and no amount of money can give those things back to me." There was silence in the courtroom, complete silence, and then I sat back down. The jury took 3 days to reach a verdict. 3 days during which I couldn't sleep or eat or think about anything except what they might be deciding. James told me to prepare for the worst. He told me that juries were unpredictable. He told me that even with all the evidence, there was no guarantee. But I knew, somehow I knew that the diary had done its work. I knew that the jury had understood. I knew that Rebecca's own words had convicted her, even though she was already dead. On the 3rd day, the jury came back. The foreman stood up and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. The land was to be returned to my grandmother's estate, which would then pass to me. Hartman Properties was ordered to divest itself of the property and restore it to its natural state as much as possible. The company was also ordered to pay damages for fraud. And Rebecca's estate, the money that she had tried to use to silence me, was ordered to be redistributed to me as compensation for the theft and emotional distress. I sat in that courtroom and I cried. Not because I was happy, but because I was finally able to stop running. Because 30 years of hiding were over. Because the truth had finally caught up with the lies. The judge looked at me with something like compassion, and she said, "Mrs. Bennett, you are free to reclaim your life." And that's what I decided to do. The day I walked back onto my grandmother's land for the first time in 35 years, I didn't recognize it. The old farmhouse was gone. The fields had been paved over. Where there had once been apple trees and wildflowers, there were now parking lots and storefronts. Hartman Properties had transformed my grandmother's legacy into a shopping district. But underneath all of that, the land was still there. The soil was still there. The foundation that my great-grandfather had built on in 1890 was still there, buried under asphalt and concrete, and the ambitions of people who had never known what it meant to call it home. James and I stood in that parking lot, and he asked me what I wanted to do. He told me that I had options. I could demand that Hartman Properties restore the land to its original state. I could sue for additional damages. I could take the money that the court had awarded me and disappear again, and this time nobody could find me. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the conversations we'd had when I was a child, sitting on the porch of that old farmhouse. She had told me that land was alive, that it had memory, that if you took care of it, it would take care of you, and if you hurt it, it would hurt you back. I told James that I didn't want to destroy Hartman Properties. I didn't want revenge. What I wanted was redemption. I wanted to take this land and everything that had happened to me, and I wanted to transform it into something healing. Something that could help other women who had been where I had been. That's when the Carol Bennett Foundation was born. I used half of the money that the court had awarded me to purchase a portion of the land back from Hartman Properties. The company agreed because the legal battle had damaged their reputation, and they wanted to move on. I kept enough money to fund the foundation's operations for the next 20 years. The other half of the money, the $4 million that Rebecca had left me, I donated to a network of women's shelters and divorce recovery programs across New York. I wanted other women to have the resources I didn't have. I wanted them to have access to lawyers and therapists and safe places to land when their worlds fell apart. And I wanted them to have documentation. I wanted them to keep records. I wanted them to write down what happened to them because that documentation had saved me. Rebecca's diary, the thing that had almost destroyed me when I first read it, had ultimately been the only thing that could prove the truth. I wanted other women to know that their stories mattered, that writing things down mattered, that the evidence of their lives was worth preserving. The foundation started small. We converted a part of the purchased land into a retreat center where women could come to heal. We brought in therapists and life coaches and lawyers who worked pro bono. We taught classes on financial independence and legal literacy. We had support groups where women could talk about their experiences without being judged. In the first year, we served 30 women. In the second year, 150. By the fifth year, we were serving over 1,000 women a year from across the tri-state area. And something miraculous happened. Women started healing. They started rebuilding. They started becoming themselves again. I remember one woman named Patricia who came to the foundation after her husband had stolen her inheritance and left her with nothing but debt. She had spent 15 years blaming herself for not seeing the signs. She had internalized all of the shame that belonged to him. When she came to us, she was a shell of a person. But Patricia was smart, and Patricia was determined. We connected her with a lawyer. We got her forensic documents. We helped her build a case. And 2 years later, we were sitting in another courtroom, watching another judge hand down another verdict of fraud. Patricia cried, and then she laughed, and then she cried again. Because for the first time in 15 years, she understood that what had happened to her wasn't her fault. There was another woman named Margaret who had been married for 40 years to a man who had slowly, methodically, isolated her from everyone she loved. He had convinced her that she was going crazy. He had convinced her that she was unstable. He had convinced her that no one would believe her. When Margaret came to the foundation, she was barely holding on. She was one bad day away from believing that ending her life was the only way to escape the pain. We taught Margaret about gaslighting. We taught her about manipulation. We taught her that what she was experiencing had a name and it wasn't her fault. We connected her with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. And we helped her understand that the voice in her head telling her she was crazy wasn't her own voice. It was the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades trying to erase her. Margaret left her husband. She got a divorce. She rebuilt her life. And the last time I saw her, she was volunteering at the foundation, helping other women understand that they weren't alone. These are the victories that matter. These are the things that the money was for. But the land itself became something more than a retreat center. It became a symbol. It became a place where people could come and understand that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. That corruption doesn't have to win. That the truth, if you dig deep enough and hold on long enough, will eventually surface and set you free. I planted a garden on the land where my grandmother's farmhouse used to stand. I planted apple trees, the same variety she had planted. I planted wildflowers. I brought the land back to life, piece by piece. And every spring, when those apple trees bloom, I think about her. I think about what was stolen from her and from me, and I think about how we got it back. 10 years after the trial, my mother came to the foundation. She was old by then, in her 80s. She walked through the gates and she looked around at what I had built, and she started crying. She told me that she had been living with guilt for decades. She told me that she had known, on some level, that what she had believed about me wasn't true. But it had been easier to believe the lie than to admit that her daughter had been betrayed and her family had failed her. I hugged my mother, and I told her that I had forgiven her a long time ago, not because what she had done was okay, but because holding on to anger was like holding onto a burning coal. It only burns you. My mother spent the last 5 years of her life volunteering at the foundation. She worked with women who had been estranged from their families. She helped them navigate the complicated terrain of reconciliation and healing. And when she died, we established a scholarship in her name for women going through family trauma. My brother eventually came too. He apologized. He told me that he had always known, deep down, that something was wrong with the narrative about me, but Rebecca had been so convincing, and it had been easier to trust her than to question her. I forgave him too, because the alternative was to spend the rest of my life angry at people, and I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to spend the rest of my life building something. The legal system eventually ruled that part of the land could not be developed further. Conservation easements were placed on 300 acres, protecting them from future development. The agreement also mandated that the remaining developed portion contribute to the foundation's operating costs in perpetuity. Hartman Properties became an unlikely partner in the mission, paying yearly fees that funded scholarships and services. 20 years after the trial, I stood on that land again. This time, I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by women who had survived betrayal, women who had rebuilt their lives, women who had found their way back to themselves. We held a ceremony to mark the land as sacred ground. We planted trees for every woman who had come through the foundation. We made a commitment that this place would always be a sanctuary, that the money and the land and the legal victory would always be used to serve women in crisis. And I made a personal commitment too. I committed to never again hide who I was. I committed to never again apologize for being betrayed. I committed to living my life loudly and openly and truthfully so that other women could see that it was possible to survive something like this and come out the other side. Because here's what I know now, after all these years. Betrayal doesn't make you weak. Surviving betrayal makes you strong. Documentation doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you powerful. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always be stronger than any lie. If you've made it this far, if this story has touched your heart or opened your eyes or made you think about your own life in a different way, I want to ask you for something. Please like this video. Please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss the other stories of women who have survived and rebuilt and reclaimed their lives. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me your location. Tell me your name if you want to, because I read every single comment. I see every single person who takes the time to connect with this story, and knowing that I'm not alone in this journey means everything. If you're living through something like this right now, know that it gets better. Know that the truth matters. Know that your story is worth telling. And know that there are people out there who will believe you and help you rebuild. I'm one of them. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to hear it all the way through. And thank you for being part of the community that's committed to protecting women from the kind of betrayal that nearly destroyed me. This is Carol Bennett, and this is the story I should have been able to tell 30 years ago. But I'm telling it now, and the truth is finally free.